Before anyone understood what was happening, the city's most feared man was already walking toward a child who had no idea who he was, yet somehow knew he was her last chance. The night would later be remembered not for the gunshots, not for the sirens, not for the whispered threats, but for a single sentence spoken in a trembling voice that cracked open a world built on silence and fear. If you feel drawn to stories where power meets compassion and darkness collides with courage, stay with this tale, and if its tone and truth resonate with you, don't forget to like and subscribe as the story unfolds, because what begins here will only grow deeper, darker, and more unforgettable. The club was the kind of place where reality bent to money and fear, where neon lights painted lies across polished marble floors, and every smile carried a price tag. And I was standing near the back of the room when Don Raphael entered, not with drama or announcement, but with the quiet inevitability of a storm arriving long before thunder. His presence altering the temperature of the air so subtly that only those who understood danger felt the chill immediately, and people moved without being told, clearing paths, lowering voices, straightening backs, because Don Raphael was not just a man but a rumor made flesh, a legend stitched from vanished enemies and impossible deals. And that night, he wore a simple dark suit that looked less like luxury and more like armor, his expression calm, unreadable, the kind of calm that came from knowing no one in the room could challenge him and survive. And as he settled into the VIP section with his inner circle, laughter returned cautiously, music swelled again, drinks clinked, and the illusion of normal life resumed. Yet beneath it all there was tension, because everyone sensed that something was off, as if the city itself were holding its breath. And I noticed it first not because of Don Raphael, but because of a girl standing near the entrance, too small for the noise, too fragile for the glitter, her dress stained, her shoes mismatched, her eyes scanning the room not with wonder but with desperation, like someone searching for a door that didn't exist. And while security glanced at her with mild irritation, assuming she was lost or begging, she didn't move toward the exits or the bar or the crowd. Instead, she walked straight forward, weaving through bodies that parted instinctively without knowing why, her steps uneven but determined, until she reached the boundary that no one else dared cross, the invisible lines separating ordinary people from Don Raphael's world. And for a moment she hesitated, her fingers clenching into fists, her lips trembling as if words were too heavy to carry. And then, before anyone could stop her, before logic could intervene, she stepped across that line and grabbed the sleeve of Don Raphael's coat. And the music didn't stop, but the room did. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses paused mid-air, guards froze with hands halfway to weapons, because touching Don Raphael without permission was not a mistake, it was a death wish. And he turned slowly, not with anger, not with surprise, but with the kind of deliberate motion that suggested he was recalculating something far older than the moment itself, his eyes dropping to the small hand gripping his sleeve, then rising to the girl's face. And in that instant I saw something I had never seen on him before. Not fear, not rage, but recognition, as if he were looking at a memory rather than a stranger. And the girl looked back at him without understanding who he was, only understanding that she had run out of options, her voice thin, shaking, but clear enough to slice through the noise of the club. "They're beating my mommy," she said. And the words didn't explode, they didn't echo, they didn't demand attention, yet they changed everything. Because Don Raphael didn't pull away, didn't signal his guards, didn't smile cruelly as many expected. Instead, he slowly placed his hand over hers, not tightly, not gently, just firmly enough to let her know she had been heard. And when he stood up, the room felt smaller, because Don Raphael rarely stood for anyone, and he looked around once, his gaze sweeping across the crowd with quiet authority, and no one dared meet his eyes. And I realized then that something irreversible had begun, something that could not be undone by money, threats, or silence, because a child had spoken truth into a world built on lies. And Don Raphael, the man who had built that world, had chosen not to ignore it. And as he took a step forward with the girl still holding his sleeve, his men rising behind him like shadows given form, I understood that the night would not end the way it began, that the club would not return to laughter, that somewhere beyond its glittering walls a woman was suffering, unaware that her fate had just collided with the most dangerous man in the city, and that whatever followed would not be mercy, not exactly vengeance, but something far more unsettling. A reckoning shaped by a man who had never been taught how to save anyone, only how to destroy. And as the doors opened and cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of rain and distant sirens, the girl tightened her grip on Don Raphael's coat, as if she sensed that once she let go, her courage might vanish. And he didn't tell her to release him, didn't tell her to step back, didn't tell her she had made a mistake. Instead, he walked forward into the darkness with her, beside him, and in that moment, watching from the edge of a world that was about to shift, I knew that this was not just the beginning of a story about power and crime, but the beginning of a story about a child who dared to interrupt destiny, and a man who dared to answer. The night outside the club felt colder than it should have, as if the city itself sensed that something dangerous had been awakened. And when Don Raphael stepped into the rain with the girl still clutching his sleeve, his men followed without questions, forming a silent wall around him, while the neon lights behind us flickered like nervous witnesses. And I stayed close enough to see everything yet far enough to remain invisible, because moments like this rarely belong to ordinary people. And Don Raphael did not rush, did not shout, did not display urgency in the way most men would when confronted with a child's fear. Instead, he walked with measured steps, his gaze fixed ahead, as though he already knew what waited in the alley long before the girl had spoken. And when he finally stopped, it was not because the girl pointed, but because he had reached the edge of the club's glow, where glamour ended and reality began. The alley narrow and damp, filled with the metallic smell of rain, and garbage and something sharper, fear. And from within it came voices, harsh, slurred, impatient, voices that did not belong to men who expected consequences. And Don Raphael raised one hand slightly, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a signal so subtle that only his men understood it, and they spread out without sound, disappearing in his shadows like extensions of his will. While he lowered himself slightly so he could meet the girl's eyes, his voice calm, steady, almost gentle. "Stay behind me," he said, not as a command but as a promise, and she nodded, though her eyes trembled. And when he stepped forward into the alley, the world seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in, the darkness thickening, until the scene revealed itself in full. Two men standing over a woman pressed against brick, her hair disheveled, her face bruised, her hands raised defensively as if she had learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. And one of the men laughed as he grabbed her wrist, his voice dripping with arrogance. And I saw Don Raphael's expression change, not violently, not visibly, but in a way that felt like the air tightening before lightning strikes. And he didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't announce who he was. Instead, he spoke softly, almost conversationally. "Let her go." And the men turned, startled, annoyed, confused by the presence of a stranger who didn't sound afraid. And one of them scoffed, stepping forward with a swagger born from ignorance. "Mind your business," he said, his hands still gripping the woman's arm. And Don Raphael didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't repeat himself. He simply looked at the man with eyes that held no emotion at all. And in that instant I understood something terrifying. That Don Raphael was not angry, not moral, not heroic. He was precise, and precision was far more dangerous than rage. And before the man could say anything else, a single sharp sound cut through the alley. Not a shout, not a scream, but the crack of a gunshot fired somewhere out of sight, the bullet striking the wall inches from the man's head, showering him with dust and fragments of brick. And both men froze, their confidence evaporating, their faces turning pale as realization dawned. And Don Raphael walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, his shoes splashing lightly in puddles, his presence swallowing the space between them. And when he reached the woman, he didn't look at the men first. He looked at her, his gaze steady, almost assessing, as if trying to understand the story written in her bruises. And then he turned his eyes back to the man, and his voice was quiet enough that they had to lean forward to hear him. "You chose the wrong place, the wrong night, and the wrong woman," he said. And the words were not dramatic but final. And before the men could respond, hands emerged from the shadows, gripping their shoulders, twisting their arms, forcing them to their knees. And Don Raphael didn't watch the struggle, didn't enjoy it, didn't linger on there. Fear. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured slightly, and the woman stumbled forward, her legs weak, her breath shaking, and the girl ran to her, wrapping her arms around her mother with a force that seemed far too strong for such a small body. And for a moment the alley was silent except for the sound of rain and quiet sobs, and I watched Don Raphael as he observed them, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed yet alert, as if he were standing not in an alley but at the center of a battlefield he had already won. And the woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion, gratitude, and fear, because she understood instinctively that the man who had saved her was not a hero in the usual sense. And Don Raphael inclined his head slightly, not in kindness but in acknowledgement. "Take your daughter and go," he said, his tone firm but not cruel, and she hesitated, as if words were forming in her mouth but lacked the courage to emerge. And then she nodded, gripping Lena's hand tightly as they stepped past him toward the streetlight, their silhouettes fragile against the glow. And as they disappeared from the alley, the two men remained on their knees, trembling, their bravado replaced by terror, and Don Raphael turned his back on them, as if they no longer existed, walking slowly back toward the club, his men falling into place behind him. But something in his stride had changed, something subtle, as if the encounter had disturbed a part of him that had been buried for years, and I followed at a distance, my mind racing, because I knew that Don Raphael did not intervene in situations without reason. He did not save strangers without purpose, and he did not allow witnesses to walk away unless their survival served a larger design. And as the club doors opened again, and the music swallowed the silence of the alley, I realized that what had happened was not a random act of mercy, but the opening move in a game whose rules only Don Raphael understood. And somewhere in the city, a woman and her daughter believed they had been rescued, unaware that their lives had just been drawn into the orbit of a man whose protection was as powerful as it was dangerous. And as Don Raphael returned to his seat, his face once again composed, his world restored to luxury and control, I knew that the story was far from over, because when a man like him chooses to intervene, he never does so halfway, and whatever he had started that night would soon reach far beyond a dark alley, into the heart of the city itself. By the time dawn crept across the skyline, the city felt different, as if it had woken from a dream it didn't fully remember, but could not forget, and rumors began moving faster than traffic, faster than news, faster than fear, because people sensed that something invisible had shifted during the night, something that could not be measured in headlines or police reports. And while the club returned to its usual rhythm, and Don Raphael resumed his role as the untouchable king of shadows, the consequences of his decision unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, across streets where power rarely revealed its hand. And within days the two men from the alley vanished from the social map of the city, not arrested, not reported missing, not mourned, simply erased, their names dissolving from conversations as if they had never existed. And no one dared ask questions because everyone understood that when Don Raphael erased someone, it was not an act of chaos but an act of order, a warning written in silence rather than blood. Yet what shocked people most was not their disappearance, but what followed, because the woman and her daughter did not vanish like ghosts as many expected. Instead, they reappeared in a way that felt almost unreal, moving into a modest but secure apartment in a quiet neighborhood, free from debt, free from fear, with a new job waiting for the woman as if fate itself had rewritten her resume. And while neighbors whispered about mysterious benefactors and sudden miracles, the truth remained hidden behind layers of discretion and power. And one afternoon, weeks after the night in the alley, Don Raphael arrived at their door without escorts or spectacle, wearing a simple coat that made him look less like a king and more like a man who had finally stepped out of his own legend. And when the woman opened the door, her hands trembled not from fear alone, but from the weight of gratitude she didn't know how to express. And Lena stood behind her, peeking around the frame with cautious curiosity. And Don Raphael knelt slightly, so his eyes met the child's, his voice quiet, steady. "Are you afraid anymore?" he asked, and Lena thought for a moment before shaking her head, her courage now softer but still intact, and he handed her a small silver bracelet, simple and unadorned, as if its value lay not in cost but in meaning. And when the woman finally gathered the strength to speak, her question came out almost as a whisper. "Why did you help us?" And Don. Raphael looked not at her, but at the city beyond the window, where buildings stood like silent witnesses to countless untold stories. And after a long pause, he answered with words that felt less like an explanation and more like a confession. "Because she was brave enough to touch something everyone else was afraid of," he said. And the woman didn't fully understand, but the city would. Because stories spread not through newspapers, but through whispers. And soon people began to talk about a child who had grabbed the devil's sleeve and lived to tell the tale. About a mafia boss who had chosen not to turn away. About a night when power bowed, if only slightly, to innocence. And while Don Raphael returned to his world of deals and shadows, something within him had changed in a way no one could name. Because he had discovered that fear was not the only force that ruled the city, and that sometimes the smallest voice could disrupt the strongest empire. And Lena grew up knowing that. Courage was not the absence of fear but the refusal to remain silent, while her mother learned that survival did not always come from strength, but sometimes from unexpected mercy. And years later, when people looked back on that night, they would not remember the club, the alley, or the vanished men. They would remember a little girl's trembling voice and a man who chose to listen. Because in a city built on darkness, it was not violence that left the deepest mark, but a single moment when compassion broke through the silence and changed everything forever.